Controlling the python population here in Florida. Governor DeSantis spoke in Stewart today about some new action.
In June of 2021, a wildlife camera positioned deep inside Big Cypress National Preserve in the heart of Florida's Everglades ecosystem captured something researchers had never documented before, anywhere, in the 4 decades since Burmese pythons first invaded the region. A male bobcat wandered into frame, discovered an unguarded python nest, and began systematically raiding it, eating some eggs, trampling others, and caching a few more for later. It returned the following day to do it again. When the nest's owner, a female python roughly 14 feet long, finally came back to find her eggs destroyed, the bobcat did not simply flee. The two animals faced off directly, the first recorded confrontation of its kind ever captured on camera. That single sequence of photographs marked a genuine turning point in how scientists understood the python invasion. For decades, Burmese pythons had operated in the Everglades essentially unopposed, an apex predator dropped into an ecosystem that had no evolutionary experience dealing with a snake this size. What that Big Cypress camera trap suggested, for the first time with hard photographic evidence, was that this might finally be starting to change. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you first need to understand just how completely Burmese pythons had taken over. The species arrived in Florida through the exotic pet trade during the 1970s and 80s, when owning a giant constrictor snake was briefly fashionable among reptile enthusiasts, who often had little idea what they were signing up for. Some owners deliberately released pythons that had outgrown their enclosures. Others lost them by accident. Then, in August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida as a Category 5 storm and destroyed a reptile breeding facility near the Everglades, releasing an unknown number of additional pythons directly into the wild. By the early 2000s, biologists had confirmed what many had feared. Burmese pythons were not just surviving in the Everglades, they were breeding there, establishing a self-sustaining population in a subtropical wetland ecosystem that turned out to suit them almost perfectly. It helps to understand exactly what made Burmese pythons such an effective invader in the first place, since that context is what makes any sign of native pushback so significant. In their native range across Southeast Asia, Burmese pythons are themselves an apex predator, but one operating within an ecosystem that evolved alongside them over millions of years, complete with its own predators, parasites, and prey species adapted to their presence. Dropped into the Everglades, pythons found a nearly ideal substitute habitat, warm, wet, dense with cover, and packed with small and medium-sized mammals that had no evolved defenses against an ambush predator of this size. Pythons hunt primarily by scent and by detecting the heat signatures of warm-blooded prey through specialized pit organs along their jaws, allowing them to locate and strike prey with very little visual cue at all, often from beneath dense vegetation or partially submerged in water. Combined with a body capable of swallowing prey many times the width of its own head, that hunting strategy let pythons work through the Everglades' native mammal population with almost nothing standing in their way for the better part of 2 decades. The consequences for native wildlife were catastrophic. Burmese pythons can grow beyond 18 feet long and weigh more than 200 pounds, with females capable of laying between 50 and 100 eggs in a single year. A study published in 2012 comparing wildlife survey data from before and after the python invasion found staggering declines in mammal populations across areas where pythons had become established, with some species, including raccoons and opossums, dropping by close to 90%, and rabbits and foxes becoming so rare in parts of the Everglades that researchers stopped detecting them at all. More than 18,000 pythons have been captured and removed from Florida since organized removal efforts began in the 1990s, and wildlife officials still consider that only a fraction of the total population, which likely runs into the tens of thousands. For most of the python invasion's history, the snake had, for all practical purposes, no natural enemies in its new home at all. The scale of what these pythons had become by the time researchers started. Documenting native predation is worth putting in concrete terms. In 2012, researchers at the Florida Museum of Natural History examined a python captured in Everglades National Park, measuring 17 feet, 7 inches long, and weighing 164 pounds, at the time the largest Burmese python ever recorded in the state. Inside her, researchers counted 87 eggs, also a record. Kenneth Crisco, the herpetologist who led the examination, noted that finding a python of this size and reproductive capacity confirmed exactly what field researchers had already suspected. These snakes were surviving for years in the wild, essentially unchallenged, with nothing in the ecosystem large enough or motivated enough to stop them before they reached this scale. That python and others like her represented precisely the kind of unchecked reproductive potential that made even small, first-of-their-kind predation events, a bobcat here, a cottonmouth there, feel significant to researchers watching for any sign the balance might be starting to shift. That is precisely what made the 2021 bobcat footage so significant to the researchers studying it. The U.S. Geological Survey team that captured the images, led by research ecologist Andrea Curillo, had been monitoring the python nest specifically to study its reproduction and hatching success, not expecting to document predation at all. What they found instead, over the course of a 2-day observation window, was a bobcat repeatedly returning to an unguarded nest, consuming, trampling, and caching python eggs, undeterred even by the risk of encountering a snake large enough to kill and eat a bobcat under different circumstances. When researchers later inspected the nest themselves, they counted 42 eggs that had been destroyed or rendered inviable. The bobcat sighting was not entirely without precedent, even if it was the first captured on camera. In 2019, the same research team had documented a python carcass found cached in a stand of cypress trees, its body marked with scratches matching the size and shape of bobcat claws. A separate python found nearby showed both scratch marks and a puncture wound consistent with a bobcat bite. Those earlier discoveries had suggested bobcats might occasionally attack adult pythons directly, but the 2021 footage was the first time researchers had actual photographic evidence of a native Florida animal successfully preying on python eggs, a far more vulnerable and biologically significant target than an occasional skirmish with an adult snake. Since that initial discovery, researchers have documented an expanding list of native species willing to take on pythons at various life stages. A study using stomach content analysis found cottonmouth snakes, a venomous native species common throughout Everglades wetlands, with juvenile Burmese pythons inside them, evidence that Florida's own snakes had begun treating baby pythons as prey. In 2023, a University of Florida research team monitoring python nests found eggs with puncture marks consistent with the beaks of black vultures, birds already known for scavenging carrion across the region, now apparently adding python eggs to their diet as well. American alligators have been photographed carrying python carcasses in their jaws, and researchers have pointed to circumstantial evidence suggesting Florida panthers and Florida black bears may occasionally kill and eat adult pythons as well, though direct documentation of those specific interactions remains limited. Florida's most technologically sophisticated response to the invasion, launched well before the recent predation discoveries, involves turning a small number of male pythons into informants. Wildlife officials surgically implant radio transmitters into captured male pythons and then release them back into the wild, tracking their movements during the winter breeding season, when male pythons travel long distances specifically to locate receptive females. Researchers follow these so-called scout snakes directly to breeding aggregations, often finding and removing a large female, along with any males that have gathered around her all at once. This approach has proven considerably more efficient than random searching, since it exploits the python's own reproductive behavior to reveal individuals that would otherwise remain almost impossible to detect in dense Everglades habitat, where the snake's camouflage and largely nocturnal habits make them notoriously difficult to spot even for experienced hunters. None of this amounts to python populations actually disappearing from Florida, and the scientists closest to this research have been careful not to claim it does. Every documented predation event so far represents a first of its kind, a single confirmed instance, rather than evidence of a broad, established pattern capable of meaningfully controlling python numbers across the Everglades. Andrea Curillo, discussing the findings publicly, described the growing catalog of predation events as building a case that the Everglades might be starting to fight back. Careful phrasing that reflects genuine scientific caution rather than a declaration of victory. Removal programs using human hunters, detector dogs, and radio-tagged male pythons, nicknamed scout snakes, that lead researchers to breeding females during mating season, remain the primary tool Florida relies on to control the python population, precisely because native predation alone has not yet been shown to make a measurable dent in overall numbers. Florida has also tried enlisting the public directly in the fight through an annual event called the Florida Python Challenge, which invites both professional and amateur hunters to compete for cash prizes based on the number and size of pythons they remove from designated public lands over a set period each year. The event draws hundreds of participants from across the country and has become one of the state's more unusual tourism draws, generating substantial media coverage each summer, even though the total number of pythons removed during any single competition period remains small relative to the estimated overall population. Programs like this exist for the same underlying reason the Scout Snake program does. With a population this large, this well camouflaged, and this difficult to survey directly, wildlife officials have had to get creative about every possible avenue for locating and removing individual snakes, whether that means paid contractors, competitive hunters, or increasingly the native predators finally starting to take an interest of their own. There is also a darker layer to this story worth being honest about. The same python invasion that has finally started attracting native predators has, over the same period, devastated the population of one of those predators directly. Research from the U.S. Geological Survey found that Everglades bobcat numbers have themselves declined by close to 90% since pythons became established in the region, likely due to a combination of direct predation on bobcat kittens and competition for the same shrinking pool of small mammal prey that pythons had already decimated. The same animal now being celebrated as a potential check on python nests is, at the population level, one of the python invasion's own victims, which makes that 2021 camera trap sequence read less like a straightforward tale of nature striking back and more like one embattled predator finding an opportunistic meal in the middle of an ecosystem that is still fundamentally out of balance. Pythons face at least one additional threat that has nothing to do with native predators at all. Researchers studying the invasive population discovered that pythons had brought a stowaway of their own into Florida, an Asian lung parasite called Rhylietiella orientalis, which has since been found not only in pythons themselves, but spreading into native snake species as well, including species already facing pressure from habitat loss and other threats. At one long-term research site where scientists had studied native pygmy rattlesnakes since the 1990s, encountering 30 snakes in a single day of fieldwork was once routine. Researchers now describe those same trails as comparatively empty, a decline some scientists suspect may be connected to the spread of this python-borne parasite through the wider snake community, layering yet another consequence of the python invasion on top of the direct predation pythons themselves are responsible for. What this research genuinely represents is not the beginning of the end for Florida's python problem, but a meaningful shift in scientific understanding of the invasion's trajectory. For nearly 2 decades, the working assumption among researchers had been that Burmese pythons faced essentially no predation pressure in the Everglades at any life stage. The accumulating evidence from bobcats, cottonmouths, vultures, and alligators does not overturn that picture entirely, but it does complicate it, suggesting that some of Florida's native wildlife may be slowly adapting to treat this invasive giant as prey rather than purely as a threat. Whether that adaptation ever grows significant enough to meaningfully slow the python population's spread remains an open question, one researchers are still actively working to answer, one camera trap and one stomach content analysis at a time. If stories like this one, about scientists documenting the slow, uncertain process of an ecosystem adapting to an invader, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.